This is chapter 17 of Jane Eyre. In chapter 16, Mr. Rochester ghosts Jane. The previous night, chapter 15, she saves his life. He's sleeping, and apparently Grace Poole tries to set him on fire, and Jane puts out the fire, warns him of the situation. Mr. Rochester goes up to the third story to, kind of get to the bottom of everything. Grace Poole is still there in chapter 16. She's A, not detained by the police, and B, she's still working at Thornfield, like nothing is wrong. And Mr. Rochester is just gone. Apparently he's hanging out with some pretty ladies, and Jane is not too happy about this. She has very low self-esteem. At the end of chapter 16, she draws a picture of herself and Blanche and thinks how ugly she is and how pretty Blanche is. In the past, my students have compared this to scrolling through your rival's Instagram and seeing their prettier pictures, or at least what you perceive to be their prettier pictures. So Jane is not in a very positive place, although she does say that comparing herself to Blanche and drawing keeps her occupied and prepares her for some drama that's going to come. So let's get to the drama. Chapter 17. A week passed and no news arrived of Mr. Rochester. 10 days and still he did not come. Mrs. Fairfax said she should not be surprised if he were to go straight from the Leas to London and thence to the Continent and not show his face again at Thornfield for a year to come. He had not unfrequently quitted it in a manner quite as abrupt and unexpected. The continent just means Europe, so England is an island, and they're talking about continental Europe. So he may just never come back to Thornfield. Great. When I heard this, I was beginning to feel a strange chill and failing at the heart. I was actually permitting myself to experience a sickening sense of disappointment. But rallying my wits and recollecting my principles, I at once called my sensations to order, and it was wonderful how I got over the temporary blunder, how I cleared up the mistake of supposing Mr. Rochester's movements a matter in which I had any cause to take a vital interest. Not that I humbled myself by a slavish notion of inferiority. On the contrary, I just said, you have nothing to do with the matter of Thornfield, further than to receive the salary he gives you for teaching his protégé, and to be grateful for such respectful and kind treatment as, if you do your duty, you have a right to expect at his hands. Be sure that it is the only tie he seriously acknowledges between you and him, so don't make him the object of your fine feelings, your raptures, agonies, and so forth. He is not of your order. Keep to your caste, and be too self-respecting to lavish the love of the whole heart, soul, and strength, where such a gift is not wanted and would be despised. So Jane is trying to talk some sense into herself and just convince herself that she really has nothing to do with Mr. Rochester. He is just the person who employs her. I went on with my day's business tranquilly, but ever and anon vague suggestions kept wandering across my brain of reasons why I should quit Thornfield, and I kept involuntarily framing advertisements and pondering conjectures about new situations. These thoughts I did not think it necessary to check. They might germinate and bear fruit if they could. So she's also thinking about leaving Thornfield and finding another job. Mr. Rochester had been absent upwards of a fortnight, so more than 2 weeks, when the post brought Mrs. Fairfax a letter. It is from a master, said she, as she looked at the direction. Now, I suppose we shall know whether we are to expect his return or not. And by direction, she means address. And while she broke the seal and perused the document, I went on taking my coffee. We were at breakfast. It was hot, and I attributed to that circumstance a fiery glow which suddenly rose to my face. Why my hand shook, and why I involuntarily spilt half the contents of my cup into my saucer, I did not choose to consider. So obviously Jane is still emotionally affected by everything, but she is denying it very courageously. Well, I sometimes think that we are too quiet, but we run a chance of being busy enough now, for a little while at least, said Mrs. Fairfax, still holding the note before her spectacles. Ere I permitted myself to request an explanation, I tied the string of Adele's pinafore, which happened to be loose. Having helped her also to another bun and refilled her mug with milk, I said nonchalantly, Mr. Rochester is not likely to return soon, I suppose? Indeed he is, in 3 days, he says. That will be next Thursday, and not alone either. I don't know how many of the fine people at the Leas are coming with him. He sends directions for all the best bedrooms to be prepared, and the library and drawing rooms are to be cleaned out, and I am to get more kitchen hands from the George Inn at Millcote, and from wherever else I can. And the ladies will bring their maids, and the gentlemen their valets, so we shall have a full house of it. And Mrs. Fairfax swallowed her breakfast and hastened away to commence operations. So Mr. Rochester is coming back to Thornfield, and he's bringing a bunch of friends. 3 days were, as she had foretold, busy enough. I had thought all the rooms at Thornfield beautifully clean and well arranged, but it appears I was mistaken. 3 women were got to help, and such scrubbing, such brushing, such washing of paint and beating of carpets, such taking down and putting up of pictures, such polishing of mirrors and lustres, such lighting of fires in bedrooms, such airing of sheets and feather beds on hearths I never beheld, either before or since. Adele ran quite wild in the midst of it. The preparations for company and the prospect of their arrival seemed to throw her into ecstasies. She would have Sophie to look over all her toilettes, as she called frocks, to furbish up any that were passés, or to air and arrange the new. For herself, she did not but caper around in the front chambers, jump on and off the bedsteads, and lie on the mattresses, and pile up bolsters and pillows before the enormous fires roaring in the chimneys. From school duty she was exonerated. Mrs. Fairfax had pressed me into her service, and I was all day in the storeroom helping, or hindering, her and the cook, learning to make custards and cheesecakes and French pastry, to truss game and garnish dessert dishes. So Thornfield is in a little bit of a happy uproar. Mrs. Fairfax is going like a little bit over the top, trying to clean everything. Adele's not going to school because Jane is forced to help or hinder. A little bit of self-deprecating parenthetical note that Jane doesn't feel like she's that helpful doing these household things. But Jane's helping, so Adele is just running around, jumping on mattresses, running amok. The party were expected to arrive on Thursday afternoon in time for dinner at 6. During the intervening period, I had no time to nurse chimeras, and I believe I was as active and gay as anybody, Adele excepted. Still, now and then, I received a dampening check to my cheerfulness, and was, in spite of myself, thrown back on the region of doubts, importance, and dark conjectures. This was when I chanced to see the 3rd-story staircase door, which of late had always been kept locked, open slowly and give passage to the form of Grace Poole, in prim cap, white apron, and handkerchief. When I watched her glide along the gallery, her quiet tread muffled in a list slipper, when I saw her look into the bustling, topsy-turvy bedrooms, just say a word, perhaps, to the charwoman about the proper way to polish a grate, or clean a marble mantelpiece, or take stains from papered walls, and then pass on. She would thus descend to the kitchen once a day, eat her dinner, smoke a moderate pipe on the hearth, and go back, carrying her pot of porter with her for her private solace in her own gloomy upper haunt. Only 1 hour in the 24 did she pass with her fellow servants below. All the rest of her time was spent in some low-ceiled oaken chamber of the 3rd story. There she sat and sewed, and probably laughed drearily to herself, as companionless as a prisoner in his dungeon. So Jane is a little bit kind of chilled and made apprehensive, nervous by Grace Poole's presence. She'll come down every once in a while. She's only really downstairs for 1 hour, and then she goes back upstairs into the 3rd story. So she's still a mysterious, sort of ominous presence for Jane. The strangest thing of all was that not a soul in the house except me noticed her habits or seemed to marvel at them. No one discussed her position or employment. No one pitied her solitude or isolation. I once indeed overheard part of a dialogue between Leah and one of the charwomen, of which Grace formed the subject. Leah had been saying something I had not caught, and the charwoman remarked, "She gets good wages, I guess?" "Yes," said Leah. "I wish I had as good. Not that mine are to complain of. There's no stinginess at Thornfield. But they're not 1/5 of the sum Mrs. Poole receives. And she is laying by. She goes every quarter to the bank at Millcote. I should not wonder but she has saved enough to keep her independent if she liked to leave. But I suppose she's got used to the place, and then she's not 40 yet, and strong and able for anything. It is too soon for her to give up business." "She's a good hand, I dare say," said the charwoman. "Ah, she understands what she has to do, nobody better," rejoined Leah significantly, "and it is not everyone could fill her shoes, not for all the money she gets." "That it is not," was the reply. "I wonder whether the master—" The charwoman was going on, but here Leah turned and perceived me, and she instantly gave her companion a nudge. "Doesn't she know?" I heard the woman whisper. Leah shook her head, and the conversation was of course dropped. All I had gathered from it amounted to this, that there was a mystery at Thornfield, and that from participation in that mystery I was purposely excluded. So Jane overhears this conversation between Leah, who works at Thornfield, and then one of these additionally hired ladies who's helping with the hearth and cleaning out things. And she finds out that Grace Poole earns more than anyone, and that her job is pretty difficult. And the woman who's working there only temporarily goes, "Oh, doesn't she know when she sees Jane?" And then Leah's like, "No, she doesn't know." So there's some kind of a mystery, but we don't know what though. Thursday came, all work had been completed the previous evening, carpets were laid down, bed hangings festooned, radiant white counterpanes spread, toilet tables arranged, furniture rubbed, flowers piled in vases. Both chambers and saloons looked as fresh and bright as hands could make them. The hall, too, was scoured, and the great carved clock, as well as the steps and banisters of the staircase, were polished to the brightness of glass. In the dining room, the sideboard flashed resplendent with plate. In the drawing room and boudoir, vases of exotics bloomed on all sides. Afternoon arrived. Mrs. Fairfax assumed her best black satin gown, her gloves, and her gold watch, for it was her part to receive the company, to conduct the ladies to their room, etc. Adele, too, would be dressed, though I thought she had little chance of being introduced to the party that day at least. However, to please her, I allowed Sophie to apparel her in one of her short, full muslin frocks. For myself, I had no need to make any change. I should not be called upon to quit my sanctum of the schoolroom, for a sanctum it was now become to me, a very pleasant refuge in time of trouble. It had been a mild, serene spring day, one of those days which, towards the end of March or the beginning of April, rise shining over the earth as heralds of summer. It was drawing to an end now, but the evening was even warm, and I sat at work in the schoolroom with the window open. "It gets late," said Mrs. Fairfax, entering in rustling state. "I am glad I ordered dinner an hour after the time Mr. Rochester mentioned, for it is past 6 now. I have sent John down to the gates to see if there is anything on the road. One can see a long way from thence in the direction of Millcote." She went to the window. "Here he is," said she. "Well, John," leaning out, "any news?" "They're coming, ma'am," was the answer. "They'll be here in 10 minutes. Adele flew to the window. I followed, taking care to stand on one side so that, screened by the curtain, I could see without being seen. The 10 minutes John had given seemed very long, but at last wheels were heard. 4 equestrians galloped up the drive, and after them came 2 open carriages. Fluttering veils and waving plumes filled the vehicles. 2 of the cavaliers were young, dashing-looking gentlemen. The third was Mr. Rochester on his black horse, Miss Roar. Pilot bounding before him, at his side rode a lady, and he and she were the first of the party. Her purple riding habit almost swept the ground, her veil streamed long on the breeze, mingling with its transparent folds, and gleaming through them shone rich raven ringlets. "Miss Ingram!" exclaimed Mrs. Fairfax, and away she hurried to her post below. The cavalcade, following the sweep of the drive, quickly turned the angle of the house, and I lost sight of it. Adele now petitioned to go down, but I took her on my knee and gave her to understand that she must not on any account think of venturing in sight of the ladies, either now or at any other time, unless expressly sent for, that Mr. Rochester would be very angry, etc. Some natural tears she shed on being told this, but as I began to look very grave, she consented at last to wipe them. So, Mr. Rochester comes, he and Blanche are kind of riding near each other. There's still all this excitement at Thornfield. Adele wants to go down and see everyone, and Jane says, "No, you have to wait until Mr. Rochester asks for you." 1800s, you are very much in this mindset that children are meant to be seen and not heard. So if they want to talk to Adele, they'll send for her. It's one of those "don't call me, I'll call you" sort of a situation. A joyous stir was now audible in the hall. Gentlemen's deep tones and ladies' silvery accents blent harmoniously together, and distinguishable above all, though not loud, was the sonorous voice of the master of Thornfield Hall, welcoming his fair and gallant guests under its roof. Then light steps ascended the stairs, and there was a tripping through the gallery, and soft, cheerful laughs, and opening and closing doors, and for a time a hush. And then Adele says, "They are changing," said Adele, who, listening attentively, had followed every movement, and she sighed. "At Mamma's, when there were a lot of people," she said, "I would follow them everywhere in the drawing room and to their rooms. Often I would watch the maids dress the ladies and do their hair, and it was so much fun. That's how you learn." So Adele is watching everyone and observing. "Don't you feel hungry, Adele?" "Yes, of course. It's been 5 or 6 hours since we've eaten." "Well, now, while the ladies are in their rooms, I will venture down and get you something to eat." And issuing from my asylum with precaution, I sought a back stairs which conducted directly to the kitchen. All in that region was fire and commotion. The soup and fish were in the last stage of projection, and the cook hung over her cubicles in a frame of mind and body threatening spontaneous combustion. So the cook is pretty stressed out, and she looks like she may explode, but Jane is sneaking down there to get her and Adele a snack. In the servants' hall, 2 coachmen and 3 gentlemen's gentlemen, which is basically a butler valet person for a noble person, rich person, kind of like Mr. Rochester. In the servants' hall, 2 coachmen and 3 gentlemen stood or sat round the fire. The Abigails, I suppose, were upstairs with their mistresses. An Abigail is also a servant, but in this case for a lady of noble rank. The new servants that had been hired from Millcote were bustling about everywhere. Threading this chaos, I at last reached the larder. There I took possession of a cold chicken, a roll of bread, some tarts, a plate or 2, and a knife and fork. With this booty I made a hasty retreat. I had regained the gallery and was just shutting the back door behind me when an accelerated hum warned me that the ladies were about to issue from their chambers. I could not proceed to the schoolroom without passing some of their doors and running the risk of being surprised with my cargo of victualage. So I stood still at this end, which, being windowless, was quite dark now, for the sun was set and twilight gathering. So Jane doesn't really want to run into these people. She's kind of like hiding out in a shadowy place until they pass. Presently the chambers gave up their fair tenants one after another. Each came out gaily and airily, with dress that gleamed lustrous through the dusk. For a moment they stood grouped together at the other extremity of the gallery, conversing in a key of sweet, subdued vivacity. Then they descended the staircase almost as noiselessly as bright mist rolls down a hill. Their collective appearance had left on me an impression of high-born elegance, such as I had never before received. So they're pretty impressive, elegant, and very refined looking. I found Adele peeping through the schoolroom door, which she held ajar. "What beautiful ladies!" cried she in English. "Oh, I wish I might go to them. Do you think Mr. Rochester will send for us by and by, after dinner?" "No, indeed, I don't. Mr. Rochester has something else to think about. Never mind the ladies tonight. Perhaps you will see them tomorrow. Here is your dinner." She was really hungry, so the chicken and tart served to divert her attention for a time. It was well I secured this forage, or both she and I and Sophie, to whom I conveyed a share of our repast, would have run a chance of getting no dinner at all. Everyone downstairs was too much engaged to think of us. Oh, so it's not a snack, it's actually dinner that they're eating, and no one's thinking about Sophie, Adele's nurse, Jane, and Adele, so good thing Jane went and raided the pantry. The dessert was not carried out till after 9, and at 10 footmen were still running to and fro with trays and coffee cups. I allowed Adele to sit up much later than usual, for she declared she could not possibly go to sleep while the doors kept opening and shutting below, and people bustling about. Besides, she added, a message might possibly come from Mr. Rochester when she was undressed. And she says, and then what a shame. I told her stories as long as she would listen to them, and then for a change I took her out into the gallery. The hall lamp was now lit, and it amused her to look over the balustrade and watch the servants passing backwards and forwards. When the evening was far advanced, a sound of music issued from the drawing-room, whither the piano had been removed. Adele and I sat down on the top step of the stairs to listen. Presently a voice blent with the rich tones of the instrument. It was a lady who sang, and very sweet her notes were. The solo over, a duet followed, and then a glee, a joyous conversational murmur filled up the intervals. I listened long. Suddenly I discovered that my ear was wholly intent on analyzing the mingled sounds and trying to discriminate, amidst the confusion of accents, those of Mr. Rochester, and when it caught them, which it soon did, it found a further task in framing the tones, rendered by distance inarticulate, into words. So Jane's listening to the music with Adele, and Jane is specifically listening for Mr. Rochester's voice. The clock struck 11. I looked at Adele, whose head leant against my shoulder. Her eyes were waxing heavy, so I took her up in my arms and carried her off to bed. It was near 1 before the gentlemen and ladies sought their chambers. The next day was as fine as its predecessor. It was devoted by the party to an excursion to some site in the neighborhood. They set out early in the forenoon, some on horseback, the rest in carriages. I witnessed both the departure and the return. Miss Ingram, as before, was the only lady equestrian, so Miss Ingram is the only lady riding a horse. Every other woman is riding in a carriage. And, as before, Mr. Rochester galloped at her side. The two rode a little apart from the rest. I pointed out the circumstance to Mrs. Fairfax, who was standing at the window with me. "You said it was not likely they should think of being married," said I, "but you see Mr. Rochester evidently prefers her to any of the other ladies." "Yes, I dare say. No doubt he admires her." "And she him," I added. "Look how she leans her head towards him as if she were conversing confidentially. I wish I could see her face. I've never had a glimpse of it yet." "You will see her this evening," answered Mrs. Fairfax. "I happened to remark to Mr. Rochester how much Adele wished to be introduced to the ladies, and he said, 'Oh, let her come into the drawing-room after dinner, and request Miss Eyre to accompany her.'" "Yes, he said that from mere politeness. I need not go, I am sure," I answered. "Well, I observed to him that as you are unused to company, I did not think you would like appearing before so gay a party, all strangers. And he replied, in his quick way, Nonsense, if she objects, tell her it is my particular wish, and if she resists, say I shall come and fetch her in case of contumacy. I will not give him that trouble, I answered. I will go, if no better may be, but I don't like it. Shall you be there, Mrs. Fairfax? No, I pleaded off, and he admitted my plea. I'll tell you how to manage so as to avoid the embarrassment of making a formal entrance, which is the most disagreeable part of the business. You must go into the drawing-room while it is empty, before the ladies leave the dinner table, choose your seat in any quiet nook you like. You need not stay long after the gentlemen come in, unless you please. Just let Mr. Rochester see you are there, and then slip away. Nobody will notice you. Will these people remain long, do you think? Perhaps 2 or 3 weeks, certainly not more. After the Easter recess, Sir George Lynn, who is lately elected member for Millcote, will have to go up to town and take his seat. I dare say Mr. Rochester will accompany him. It surprises me that he has already made so protracted a stay at Thornfield. So, Mrs. Fairfax told Mr. Rochester that Adele has been asking to see the ladies, and Mr. Rochester says, oh, she can come, and make sure Jane comes, and Mrs. Fairfax says, well, she's maybe not be too comfortable in front of all these people that she doesn't really know that well. And Mr. Rochester says, oh, tell her that I'll get her if she doesn't come. So Jane has to go to meet all these people with Adele. Mrs. Fairfax says, just kind of, make sure you don't make a formal entrance. That would be kind of awkward, and I'll tell you how to skate by without really being noticed. You didn't often have too much interaction between social classes in a lot of 1800s books and circumstances. So because Jane is a governess, she would kind of be much like Adele, kind of seen and not heard sort of a thing. So she wouldn't really socialize with these people in a regular context. So she's kind of just there to watch Adele, but it does put Jane in a little bit of an awkward social situation for the 1800s. All right, and then Mrs. Fairfax is also surprised that Mr. Rochester has stayed so long at Thornfield, and she doesn't think that the guests will stay for too very long. One of them, Sir George Lynn, is a part of a political organization, kind of like part of the local government, so he can't stay past a certain point.